Well, yes, we've heard that it's something that's happening all around the world, workers calling for wage increases amid the price rises. So let's talk to an expert, Rosalía Vazquez-Alvarez from the International Labour Organization. Thank you very much for joining us. We've seen the strikes today by Lufthansa workers, as we heard Christy talking about just there. It's an example of many pay strikes recently. Just how hard is the rising cost of living hitting the average worker?
Okay, so for what we observe in our data sets, we see that erosion of wages, real wages, is actually happening everywhere in just about all the different countries around the world. Just to give you some examples, in the US, Japan, and Mexico, wages have declined by 2% in real terms since the beginning of the year. But in countries like Sweden and of the Netherlands, for example, if we compare wages, real wages, from 2020, January 2020 to today, we observe a 5% decline. So clearly what we observe is that wages are not keeping up with inflation, and this is actually eroding the purchasing power of families around the world.
OK, so there is a genuine concern, but I guess it depends on the region as to how hard it's hitting. But there is the concern, a lot of discussion among economists about the possibility of a wage price spiral. So when wages go up, workers demand more goods, driving up the cost of those goods. Is the fear of rising wages driving inflation, is that justified? What would you say?
We wouldn't say that that's justified, not according to the data that we see. For example, if you look at wage growth across the world in the past 10 years, what we observed is wages have actually increased by only 1%. If you look at high-income countries, that's even less than 1%. But even more than that, what's the telling figure is that if you look at productivity growth and you look at wage growth, there is a growing gap between the two, and productivity growth is what actually should drive wage growth. And there is actually a growing gap that it's about 10% approximately in terms of percentage points. So clearly there is no such thing as a wage price spiral. A wage price spiral is usually associated with the situation where you have low unemployment, followed by high aggregate demand, followed by high wage demands. But the wage bargaining process, it's actually been relatively weak in the past decades. So clearly there is no such thing as a situation where wage price spiral may actually drive higher wage growth and higher inflation rates. In fact, inflation is actually driven by the fact that you have the supply chain problem in the process, and that actually is what drives high inflation. But it's not necessarily true that the data is telling us today that there is going to be an actual wage price spiral going on in the near future, nowhere, anywhere in the world.
OK, so can you give us some good news here, just briefly? Are things going to get better anytime soon?
Well, it depends very much on the kind of combination of policies that you put in place. If you have only tight interest rates, tight monetary policy, without any other type of policy going on, such as reassuring that wages are actually keeping up with inflation, then clearly you may actually erode wages even further. That will actually decrease aggregate demand, that will have a significant impact at reducing employment levels. And so there is not necessarily the case that only tight monetary policy should be put in place. Government has to look into the whole process and put together policies that help also particularly low-income families who are more hit by inflation than the average family in the population.